Welcome back to another edition of the Edge podcast. Publisher Brenden Slaughter, joined by Beaver's writer Ryan Harlan, as we're coming to you guys following Oregon State's 49-14 loss to Oregon. We're going to be previewing the matchup against Purdue at Reser Stadium this Saturday, and wanted to welcome you guys back to the podcast. Obviously, Oregon State going to be looking to flush the unfortunate rivalry game score and result that came out to be. We'll briefly discuss it here, but Ryan and I have kind of already gotten into the nuts and bolts of that game over at Beaver's Edge and here on our Beaver's Edge YouTube channel. So we'll kind of get into that a little bit, but good to see you, Ryan. Obviously, we just got done with Tuesday and Wednesday interviews. I just want to start here. What's kind of been the vibe from the players on the offense and defense these 2 days, kind of getting back to work after, what you and I kind of described was a bit of a rough game on Saturday?
The biggest thing is like everybody's looking ahead towards Purdue. It's, the
Yeah.
old Belichickian saying, and I kind of said it too on Saturday of we're on to Purdue, and that's kind of what the mindset has been this week. I know at least for what Bray said on Monday and then what Gundy said on Tuesday was, hey, we hung in there against the top 10 team in the country in Oregon and for that first half, and that they kind of hammered that, emphasized that a lot. And it was just more of the fundamentals on defense and getting away from what, makes them successful and what they're able to do. And Coach Hayward spoke of that today. It was kind of, yeah, we cut guys too loose. Everybody's kind of second guessing a little bit of what their assignments were and just kind of playing, not playing fast or playing a little
Right.
more, kind of apprehensively and being not trusting their keys and things like that. And really the big emphasis for them was just getting back to that and learning how to play like they have the past couple of weeks beforehand, because I think Chisholm kind of said it best. It's like we're the type of defense that we are is we're not that what we showed on Saturday. We're
Yeah.
what we showed in those first couple of weeks, and they're going to try to get back to that again, welcoming another Big Ten team into town.
Yeah, it's one of those things, Ryan, where I think we kind of covered it pretty well, but just the results still, even a few days later, as we're sitting here, breaking it down and analyzing it, it still doesn't feel like an Oregon State home game in the sense that, I really, we wrote about it. It was their worst home loss since 2019. They had been such a consistent team at home. I mean, you go back to those last couple home losses. 3-point loss to Washington, where you were right there until the final moments. 3-point loss to USC. You were right there in the final moments. And, then I just think when you look at how good of a team the Beavers had improved to be at home, Ryan, I think a couple things kind of came to my foreground as kind of breaking it down, in the days since, where, I think credit needs to be given to the group of players the last 2-3 years that were on the team that aren't anymore, who helped kind of instill that culture. Because maybe I don't want to say or anyone took it for granted, but when you're looking back, like how good Oregon State was at home the last couple years, against good opponents too, I think that's certainly something that you can hang your hat on. And then two, I think it just shows how quickly the game kind of got away from in the second half, and that was the key thing you said there. They hung with a top 10 team for a half, right?
Yep.
And it's true. You and I at halftime were like, well, shoot, if the defense can kind of figure some things out, offenses move the ball well. It was an 8-point game. Oregon had the ball first, but maybe the defense forces a turnover, and, Oregon State's right back in it. And it just kind of seemed like things spiraled. I'm more curious on the defensive side, because I think the offensive side, I think they still showed some things in the second half, but I think, they will never say this, Ryan, but I think once the offense kind of realized, hey, those guys on the other side of the ball aren't going to stop anybody today, I think it kind of added to it. But when Keith Hayward was talking a little bit about guys trying to do too much, that kind of sounds a little reminiscent of some of the early rebuild days of the previous regime, right? Particularly, I'm that wording just kind of surprised me a little bit. Is that just because you think there are so many new guys on this defense that they're working in as far as first time starters and stuff like that? And do you think it truly can be just an aberration?
I think it could be. And also too, at the same time, it's, you have, yeah, it's a very young defense, and
Right.
there's going to be growing pains for some of those guys where it's like where it's a learning experience. It's something where they're gonna have to learn that, like, hey, trust what trust what you're doing out there, and more of not try to second guess yourself and how
Right.
you're playing. And I think that just comes with time. I think that comes with experience, and yeah, I think this could be an aberration, but and from what they basically made it sound like, it was like a, hey, we've turned the page on this. We've gotten back to practice. We started doing what we needed to do out there, and now it's just seeing if those strong practices can translate over onto the field on Saturday, because that's really what I think, you know, we need to see from this group is how do you respond to adversity? And Bray said it too, where like, hey, we did not play like last year. We did not play well against Washington State. That's basically what
Right.
he said. He's like, did not play well at all. But that group went out there and responded really well against the top, what was it at the time, 15 Utah
Yeah,
team,
I think Utah was 12, if I remember correctly. It
something
was
like that. Yeah.
something like that. Yeah, yeah.
And so looking at that kind of response and being like, hey, we know what the standard is. We need to play up to it. And I think they should be able to be more than capable of doing that. It's just, yeah, you just kind of got boat raced there
Yeah,
in
I
the
mean, I
second half. And
think,
it didn't help that
yeah,
you went 3-and-out to start it
right.
either.
And
So that killed a lot of momentum too, on top of that.
for sure. And I think that's a good way to put it, Ryan, because, the other way that I would rationalize it a little bit, from the Oregon State perspective is, you know, you have to look at each game in a vacuum, Ryan. That Oregon team that we saw on Saturday was not the same Oregon team that was figuring things out against Idaho and Boise State. For lack of better terms, Oregon, I begrudgingly have to give them credit. Dan Lanning was able to bottle up everybody saying from the outside for 2 weeks, hey, we don't know about Oregon. Hey, we don't know about Oregon. Hey, we don't know about Oregon. And Oregon kind of came in like a freight train. Sure, Oregon State was able to move the ball. I give great credit. I don't think the Ducks have a world beating defense. But Ryan, when Oregon's offense was rolling, it was like there was no I mean, and I don't mean to throw them under the bus again, like we kind of said we already did, but like there was no resistance from Oregon State's defense. There was maybe one tackle for loss, maybe two. I don't have the stats right in front of me, but it was a very low number. I think I remember the one tackle for loss because I think the very next play was the Gabriel big touchdown run. So it was just one of those situations where it seemed like Oregon State really wasn't able to do much, and Oregon played perfectly. And I think, again, back to that rationalization point, Ryan, if you're a Beaver fan looking for a positive, you have to say, well, that right there, that's the Oregon team that we thought was probably a top five preseason team, had a, borderline Heisman candidate at quarterback who had started 50 some odd games in his college career. Like, that was the Oregon team that we expected when we previewed this game and the line was originally some 30 points. I think those first two games kind of brought up expectations, and whether or not, that's just natural. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think Oregon just kind of showed why they're an elite team and they're going to win, 9, 10, 11 games this year.
Yeah, and exactly the way that I like said it after the game was, I think this could have been the game where they figured it all out, as much
Right.
as, much as that's kind of hard to do
It
in
is.
a
Yeah.
road environment where, well, technically, 40 minutes up north from them. But like, I think it's quite possibly that where the first 2 weeks, what we saw was just them trying to figure out what this team's going to look like.
Right.
And then they pieced it all together, headed into week 3. But yeah, I think, kind of looking at this and kind of vacuuming, it's like, yeah, this was kind of the outcome to be expected. And now it's just to see, like, okay, you suffered a really bad loss at home. How do you respond back now against another Big Ten team, albeit in the lower kind of tier
Yeah.
of Big Ten teams, but still talented nonetheless. And that's something where now it's just kind of like, okay, what's this next step for this team going forward? Because I think this will truly tell us a lot about where Oregon State is at, because you did what you were supposed to do the first 2 weeks, and then week 3 was week 3. So Purdue kind of, I think, is not I don't think Bray and the coaching staff will say it, but I think maybe that might be their litmus test of where they are. And I know that they've hung around on that first half thing all this week, but like, it more so I think might be that true litmus test of where they're at there. And that maybe
Yeah.
just me having had low expectations going into this game a little bit, where I kind of maybe expected this to be a little more competitive than it truly was. But now I think it's kind of okay, like you got beat.
Yeah.
How do you respond to this going into
Yeah.
this week?
No, totally, 100%. I think that's going to be their mindset going into this game. And that's the good news, Ryan, is that outside of I'll say this: talent for talent, you want to look at star power. Oregon State will not play a more talented team in the regular season. If you're talking pure stars, pure, NIL athletes, all that stuff. Period. Your toughest team is out the door. Now that being said, Boise State at the end of the year going to be a real tough game. That's probably your number two. Washington State at home, that game has gotten really, really tough as time's gone along. You've also got UNLV, who just went on the road and beat Kansas. So all of a sudden, the home slate looking a little tougher. But in the interim, let's talk a little bit of the Purdue Boilermakers, because it is a prime opportunity, Ryan, for a bounce back. And it was tough to kind of see that in the moment of the post game, obviously, as Oregon State fell to Oregon this last week. But you go to this game, Oregon State opened as a 5.5 point favorite for this game. They're currently settling in as a 4.5 favorite per ESPN FPI. They give the Beavers a 75.7% chance of winning this game, Ryan. So lots of favor. The money on this particular case is on the side of
Yeah.
Oregon State. And when you consider what happened at Purdue last week, they had a pretty lopsided loss themselves, more lopsided if that was possible. They lost to Notre Dame 66-7, and Notre Dame, as we know, suffered a loss to Northern Illinois the week before. So
Yeah.
Purdue was a little bit of the sacrificial lamb for the Fighting Irish this last week, but both teams are going to come in off a pair of blowout losses. And I'm very curious to see, Ryan, who kind of wants this game more, because I think both teams are kind of in a similar spot. Purdue obviously has played one less game, but they got a big win over Indiana State in week one, took a bye, and then, fell to Notre Dame last week. Oregon State, meanwhile, has played three games. We'll kind of get into the matchups of this, but just on the surface, how do you feel about Purdue, a team that, we expect to probably be in the 3, 4, 5 win range this year in Big Ten play?
Mentioning the line, that's kind of interesting given the track record a little bit of Purdue. I mean, you get that big blowout win, right, against Indiana State, then you get blown out by Notre Dame.
Yeah.
So we don't really know how good this Purdue team actually is.
Good or
That's
bad,
the
right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing. We don't know how good they are, and that's something where I'm like, I can understand it leaning towards Oregon State and the
Yeah.
more of that, but really, yeah, it's like you said, it's just going to be more of a who wants this game more, and I think for the Beavers especially, it's like you know what you're capable of. You know that this wasn't your best look out there, especially in the second half against Oregon, and you know what you're capable of, and I think they come out there with a little bit of a fire lit underneath them,
Yeah.
especially too. And I think same thing for Purdue, but Purdue's traveling, and
So I got some
that's
numbers
the
with that, Ryan.
yeah, that's
It
the other thing.
Yeah, I
That's
got
the other
some.
thing. So I'm like, I'd lean a little more in favor of Oregon State on that, but like the odds makers have, but I think that truly is a toss up given what we've seen. But then again, like you said, you take it week by week and anything can happen any given Saturday. So
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think you hit on some great points. I was actually doing some, when preparing our closer look at Purdue article, and definitely make sure to check that out at Beaver's Edges. We got a whole bunch of information up on the Boilermakers. But when I was looking into that matchup, Ryan, and was kind of seeing some of the player interviews and coach interviews this week, because of how kind of bad that result was against Notre Dame, the players and the coaches of the team for Purdue have kind of embraced it, been like, well, Nothing better than getting the heck out of Dodge and going to play somewhere else because it was so bad, here this last week kind of a thing. And they're kind of rallying around that. But just to throw out some numbers, obviously it will change now that geography means absolutely nothing in the in college football. And Ryan and I might throw a couple nuggets on that as well, as there's some more realignment buzz that continues to happen as the pack is looking to add some teams. So maybe talk about that a little bit at the end of the podcast. But Ryan, this is the fifth longest road trip in Purdue history by miles, which is just insane. They will have to trek 2,221 miles from West Lafayette, Indiana to Corvallis. And I mean, again, it's kind of a silly little stat, I know, but that's a long time to come
Hmm.
all the way this way. And then, as you know, we don't know everyone's exact itinerary, but no team has taken a 737 into the Corvallis International Airport. Not yet, anyway. So, again, your options as a team like that are to Portland and bus down, or more likely to Eugene and then bus up. But either way, Ryan, like one of those things for a team that's never done it before, kind of like going to Pullman, going to Corvallis is a weird road trip. You're not staying in a hotel in town. Like Purdue's probably getting in, but then they're probably staying in like Albany or something like that. So I think, again, those Pac-10 teams, but as Oregon State plays a more quasi Mountain West and more teams coming in. We heard about Wake Forest today. We'll talk about that a little bit as well too. Corvallis is a unique place to go play a football game. And I think there will be a couple guys that Purdue bus, Ryan, who are like, where are we before they pull into Corvallis ultimately? Because it's going to be a journey. So that
Yeah.
travel will certainly play into it. And I think that's where, even if the odds makers didn't necessarily have an inkling, you lean with the team who doesn't have to travel 2,500 miles.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, travel as much as it doesn't mean anything anymore now, it's kind of like that's going to play a big factor.
It
And
will.
I know we're in football season at the moment, but when we get into basketball, when we get into baseball for teams that are in Big Ten and
Yeah,
Big 12 and ACC, like I think that's gonna be a huge impact going forward. But as of right now, we're probably just maybe seeing how much of the little like inklings of how much this may become a factor going forward
sure.
throughout the season. But yeah, that should be an interesting game though, nonetheless.
No, for sure. And
Yeah.
and a couple things I want to mention too, because you were obviously around, Ryan. This is the second of a home and home that Oregon State is scheduled with Purdue. It concludes the season opener in 2021. And gosh, I remember that game like it was yesterday, Ryan.
Same.
I feel like it was years ago at the same token. That was very famously the game that Sam Neuer started. Chance
Hmm.
Nolan comes in. Oregon State didn't quite have enough in that game. They fall 30 to 21. And that kind of, ultimately there was that what happened that game ignited Oregon State going to a bowl game that year and so many other things that ultimately happened that year. Trent Bray was elevated to defensive coordinator that year after a few other not so great games. So it's funny how the journeys between these two teams have gone because Purdue had like a moment under Jeff Brom. He ended up going to Louisville, and now they're kind of in a rebuilding moment as well. And this obviously is obviously the second year of the Ryan Walters experience. But again, a team, Ryan, that is still, rebuilding in their own right, and a team that on paper, Oregon State looks to be a little bit better than this season. And we'll kind of get into the numbers, but yeah, that 2021 game feels like just yesterday, man. It's crazy how time flies.
Oh, I know. You mentioned Sam Neuer. I'm like, well, then again, that game he had a George Karlaftis problem of where he was in the backfield
Yeah.
constantly.
Yeah, that was a
He
problem.
just was a wrecking ball for that defensive line of Purdue, and now Karlaftis is with my Kansas City Chiefs. So kind of funny moment. And same year too, as well about that. That was when Trent McDuffie also was on Washington that year,
Oh
and
wow. There
also
you go.
yeah,
There you go.
yep, yep.
Yeah.
I remember that game too, where he just didn't even look his way. So it's like
Yeah,
it's
he
kind
was
of funny
really good.
how the years pan out kind of after that for some of those players that you see out there opposing schools and now go to your favorite NFL team. Yeah.
Totally. And on that point, like I mentioned in our season preview like a month and a half ago, there's a younger Karloftis who is still with Purdue this year. Not quite as impactful. Don't need to worry quite as much, Beaver fans. But if you hear the name at Reser Stadium, don't think old George came down from the Kansas City Chiefs to bring
Yeah.
bring the Beavers some hay in the backfield again. But yeah, Ryan, let's get into some of the numbers here from this game. Again, like you said, Purdue is much more of an incomplete. Oregon State, you kind of know what sort of team they are after 3 games, despite the lopsided game last week. Purdue, it's so much more open-ended in the sense that they annihilated Indiana State in week 1, then were annihilated in week 2. So you have both ends of the spectrum. So again, take these numbers with a grain of salt. But again, the numbers that I'm looking at, Ryan, and arguably the biggest one, Notre Dame had almost 400 rushing yards last week against Purdue in this match when they beat Purdue. Almost 400 yards on the ground. Obviously, I would imagine very much like Oregon State, that game kind of spiraled, got out of control early and so on and so forth. But, looking at the numbers, Purdue, as far as their run defense, they rank 127th, given up across those 2 games, an average of 233, compared to their passing defense, which in this case is a little bit superior and is, let's see here, had it right in front of me. Yes, so pass defense is a little bit more efficient in the high 20s. So Oregon State's bread and butter, Ryan, is obviously being able to run the ball and run the ball efficiently, maintain clock, all that stuff. They've got 2 or 3 guys that can really tote the rock. Is this a game where you lean in to that disparity again? Like, obviously, Oregon State will, but do you lean even further into it knowing Purdue got burned so bad in that regard last week? Or do you think Purdue's like, well, we're going to have to put 9 guys in the box? And like, how do you think Purdue's going to handle after Notre Dame put up such an ugly number and they're like, here's another team in Oregon State who really likes to run the ball?
I, well, for Purdue's defense, they typically like to be in man anyway, and that's something where I think Gunderson can exploit pretty effectively, given the fact that Darius Clemens is supposed to make his season debut on
Good
Saturday,
point. Good point.
and that's another weapon in the passing offense that I just don't think we've quite seen yet. We've seen McCoy being able to make the throws that he's needed to, but in those first 2 games, and even against Oregon, Beavers were running the ball, and that's what they want to do. They want to establish the run early, and if it's working, they're not going to go away from it unless Purdue gives them a reason to, because I think we saw it with Idaho State. Gundy basically said, "Okay, we're going to run the ball
Right.
until you can stop us." And then finally, when Idaho State started crowding the box, that's when that 50-yard touchdown pass to David Wells happened, and
Right.
that's something where, like, I think you might see maybe not the exact game plan like that, but I think you'll probably see something along the lines of that, and probably maybe a little more go from the passing game in particular, because I know Gundy was saying this week that they had like 7 explosive plays and they were going to try to do something with that little flea flicker and just didn't really pan out. But I think they want to try to get that going early, because they know that, like, yeah, we want to get ahead of the sticks and do what we need to do for that. And they're not the offense to come from behind, but they're going to establish the run early, set up the play action passes deep. And I think that's how they're going to do it. And maybe get a little more involved with tight ends, especially
Yeah.
too the fact that Purdue will sit in that man coverage most of the time. And that stat that you brought up about their passing defense makes sense if you're sitting in man if you're sitting in
Right.
man
I
most of the
mean,
snaps out your base defense, if you're in that most of the
yeah.
time, that makes sense
I mean
as to why.
That Notre Dame Purdue game, Ryan, was going on congruently with the CW as we're sitting in the stadium there obviously on Saturday. And I just remember seeing some tweets like, and Notre Dame runs again. Not like they needed to pass. So it was one of those games where, Notre Dame really was able to pound the rock. And it does kind of surprise me when I look at their numbers because That's the thing is you still have to treat Purdue like a power four team with power four talent because they do, Ryan. Like I'm looking, their defensive end, Will Holt, he leads the Big Ten in sacks per game with just over one per right now. So there are still going to be dudes in the trenches and guys at linebacker. You mentioned guys at defensive back who play man. This is still a team who, if Oregon State, relative, and I'm not saying that they will, but just for the sake of argument, if Oregon State shows up thinking it's going to be so much easier playing Purdue's defense after what happened in Notre Dame than say Oregon, they could still surprise them. Like this is not, Idaho State's defense where you're going to wear it down after 4 quarters. This is power forward depth, and that's why I said I don't think Oregon State has to look for their advantages where they can get it. And again, this is a defense that, like you said, has some holes, but is better against the pass. They're going to play man to man. So, where, like you said, you maybe look for Darius Clemens and Trent Walker, particularly Trent Walker, on those drag patterns to kind of get more in space again, like we've seen. And maybe Clemens is able to go over the top and kind of be that guy on the post patterns and flag routes and those kind of things, streaks to kind of get you more towards the end zone because. We talked about it, Ryan, post game, and it got asked again to Trent Bray on Monday. The explosive offense has not been there. And again, it's early, but if there was one pretty pointed criticism when Trent Bray took over as head coach, it was offense held us back the last couple years. Passing game held and I should be more clear. The inability to pass when they needed to pass is what they felt was what held them up against Washington, held them up against USC, held them up against Oregon in those last couple years and kept them out of the Pac-12 championship. And I think it's a fair assessment. You look back at Oregon State's quarterback play, they weren't able to hit the big play, and receivers too, weren't able to hit the big play downfield when needed to break the lid off the defense because, Damian Martinez and company couldn't do it all. Now, looking ahead now, Ryan, it's a different offense. Don't get me wrong, but a lot of the same problems still exist. And, I think it might have been somewhat easy to criticize, but in reality, I think I think just considering the personnel that Oregon State have, it's going to take time to develop an explosive offense, I think.
I think so too, but like we also heard it all off season. I think the criticism I have is we heard it all off season of, hey, this is more up tempo, this is more explosive, this
Tempo,
is
yeah.
more exciting, a more exciting offense. Like we heard that from the players, and we heard that from Gunderson, and we've heard that from also the position coaches too on the offensive side of the ball, that
Right.
there's like, especially for the tight ends, they're being asked to do a lot more than they had in previous years. But we haven't quite seen that play out yet. And now whether that could be that it's just how the first couple of games have gone, just dictating that and just going with the flow and how that's going. Like, okay, sure, fair. Like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If something's working, stick with it. And that's something where I would agree with play calling on that. But like, but you also need to be able to keep up with higher powered offenses too at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, and not necessarily just impose your will through the ground game too, because after a certain point, if a team is getting away from you, you can't really stick to your bread and butter anymore. You have to go beyond the scripted plays. You have to go beyond what you're good at in order to win those games where you need to make those throws to make those those big plays happen. And that's something where you mentioned USC, you mentioned Washington. Oregon State was a couple big throws away from winning those
Winning.
games, particularly Washington
Yep.
were
Yep.
away from winning those
Oh
games.
yeah.
So that's something where I think we need to see that develop yet. But also looking at personnel, they don't have the speed like they did in years past. You don't have that Anthony Gold, you don't have that Silas Bolden that can really take that top off of defense. Sure, you have Zach Card in there, but he's been kind
Hasn't
of
played much.
yeah, non-factor for the most part, really
Yeah.
been on special teams for the most part. Few offensive snaps. So that's something where I think it's going to take some time, but also it's kind of more of a like, and Gundy too kind of alluded to it. It's like, hey, I need to be better in how I'm calling things, and just developing that rapport and opening things up a little bit more with McCoy and the receivers, just being able to make those plays happen.
Absolutely. And, kind of on that point, I harken back to conversations we had in the offseason, Ryan. You know what? It sounds like we're just describing the intricacies of a first year offensive coordinator. And we
Yep.
knew it was going to have some ups and downs, right? Just like it's the first time head coach in Trent Bray, right? And
And defensive coordinator too.
right. So, just new pieces across the board and obviously settling into their roles. I mean, obviously, Keith Hayward had been one previously, but not for a couple seasons, being, I think he was a quality control with the Raiders.
Yes.
So again, very, very different than being a coordinator, obviously. Obviously, he had that in his bag, but just everyone kind of, brought back into the mix and then you add in the new personnel, right? Then you add in all the losses that they had in the offseason. And I think that is, I'm not making excuses, but I think that is kind of okay, A plus B equals C kind of a thing where it's like, yeah, you add all that up and it's like it makes sense why they've been a little bit more inconsistent and why we've seen an offense that averages, 24 points a game and it's kind of been a little run heavy and dare I say stagnant at times, and then a defense that looked really good the first couple weeks, but now the numbers are slightly skewed because of a really ugly game against Oregon, where again, Oregon State's defensive numbers are what they are, but they're still not a true representation because they got a really ugly outlier in there now. And like as Ryan and I mentioned earlier, that game obviously got away in the second half. Before we finish up the podcast, I want to thank everyone for joining Ryan and I. Let's flip to the other side, Ryan. A familiar foe under center for the Purdue Boilermakers. So familiar, in fact, he took a campus visit at one point and was boots on the ground in Corvallis before ultimately it was DJU who came to Oregon State and Hudson Card who went out to Purdue. But the former Texas signal caller Hudson Card is going to be bringing his Boilermakers into Purdue this or into Oregon State this weekend. Ryan, obviously, he's a talented quarterback. He hasn't put it all together at Purdue. Obviously, last year they had a rough year, but he's got, growing skill position talent players around him. And, I think they are they're a team that in the grand scheme of things, like I mentioned before, they're a team with enough talent that if you take them lightly and take them for granted, they can make plays on you. And that's the kind of talent they have. I mean, I love Cam Brown, their wide receiver who just kind of got back in the mix. He and Hudson seem to have a pretty good chemistry already. Their tight end could be a matchup problem for Oregon State, particularly, is it Melvin Jordan, Isaiah Chisholm? Is it, I don't know if Oregon State quite as a nickel or a DB big enough to go toe to toe with Max Clare, but he's really good the first couple of weeks. He's got, 8 catches for 107 yards. So, there will be some challenges on that side of the ball. That being said, though, Purdue's offense has not been particularly efficient against stronger competition that's not Indiana State. Again, back to that small sample size, Ryan.
Yeah, and I mean you could possibly put maybe Skylar Thomas
That's a
on
good
the
call.
tight end,
Yeah.
more of that bigger
What?
body,
Yeah.
safety, maybe that safety help there. But yeah, it's just kind of like it's one of those things where you take it week by week, and if you overlook somebody, they're gonna be able to take advantage of that. And I really think for Oregon State, it's just more of like a hey, this is another talented team. Don't take them lightly, especially after the result of last week. Not saying that the Beavers did or anything like that, but like
Reality.
I
Yeah.
think I think that's like I think that's something where it's just yeah, you know that they have talent and you know that you can hang with top tier talent in that conference in particular, and now it's just going out there and proving that you can hang with this Purdue team for 4 quarters straight, because they showed it for a half and now you just got to do it for 4, because going back to what Gunderson and Bray said this week of, hey, we hung in there with Oregon for a half.
hmm
We could have hindsight, we could have hung in there for 4 quarters, but ultimately, yeah, we know they didn't. But that's basically, I think the message is now it's like, hey, you know what you're capable of, and if you want to play the best that we think you can, at least for the coaches are saying that to players, like, you know, Chisholm said today, like Coach Cooper was like, "Hey, we know we can be the best linebacking unit in the country, and it's up to you guys if you want to play up to that standard, at that for for this season." And that's something where I think if they go out there and they play up to that high level of a standard, I
Yeah.
think they can pull out a win against a really talented opponent. And it's just doing it now for 4 quarters and doing it consistently and being able to hit on those big plays, also offensively too, and being able to at least show more a little bit on offense. Because sure, they're going to be in man most of the time, but when those play calls aren't working, how does
Right.
Gunderson respond? And I think it's going to be a really big tell this weekend, because that's, I like I said earlier, I think it's going to be their litmus test. And really, if they're able to show that maybe Darius was the missing piece in the passing game
It's
all
true.
along, then I think a lot of the worries that we have about this team offensively may be put to bed for the most part. But it's just a matter of putting it all together on Saturday and actually executing it on the field, because we can talk in hypotheticals all we want. You just got to see it 4 quarters on Saturday.
Totally.
That's
And
yeah,
and I think it's going to be, two teams that again were blown out, two teams that are very motivated to get the taste of losing out of their mouth. So I think within reason, it's going to be a really good game at Reser Stadium on Saturday. And I think you're going to see two teams who leave it all on the field. I think Oregon State's going to be a little bit better. I'm going to be picking them in this matchup, and obviously check out our predictions later in the week. But throughout the early prediction and today's closer look at Purdue. And then obviously I think the atmosphere is going to be just as good. Obviously, um, the students were in full force last week. There was not an empty student section when that game started. But this is going to be even more intense because all the students will be fully back on campus. It's going to be just before school gets started. It's going to be a night game, night within reason in the, evening. So I think, that's going to be, there's going to be some energy. And then not to mention, Ryan, you got to make sure to, not we, but the fans have to make sure to wear their corresponding stripe out too. So make sure to figure out what section you're in and wear the proper stripe. But it's going to be a great matchup at Reser Stadium on Saturday. Want to throw out a big shout out to Ryan Harlan for joining me on this edition of the podcast. We'll be back obviously next week. Ryan, we will be catching up with you next week as well, and I'll be bringing you guys coverage from the Purdue game on Saturday. Appreciate you joining me on this edition of the podcast, man. Looking forward to this matchup against Purdue, and yeah, we'll obviously be talking this early next week.
yeah, likewise. And yeah, if you're a student, wear orange.
Yeah,
It's
see,
easy
Ryan's
for you.
got you covered, guys. Got you covered.
Easy for you.
Well, yeah, appreciate Ryan again, and thanks to everyone for checking out this edition of the Edge podcast. Stay locked into Beaver's Edge for everything post game from Purdue Saturday evening.